Hello everyone, today we'll be having a quick word about demographics in the medieval era. Mostly because of there being so many fantasy novels and video games and movies, there have been a lot of tropes that have popped up about population centers in the medieval era. Be they villages, towns, or cities, they're always varying. Sizes aren't always accurate, nor are the spread of population centers accurate either. Well, when you're talking about the size of a medieval settlement, it depends on what you're talking about. Is it about population, or the volume, or just the square area of the settlement itself? Well, when you're talking about population, keep in mind that most settlements in the medieval era were much smaller than medieval settlements. Your average village would be around 300, 400 people living in them. Of course, some villages could be quite large, like 800, 900, up to 1,000 people in size, but these were rare and typically only on very important areas, be they trade routes or river crossings of some type. Most villages would be around 300 to 400 people, with there being, of course, smaller villages, satellite villages, some of which would be hamlets, being around 50, 60, up to 100 people. Speaking of hamlets, a lot of fantasy seems to believe that a small village that is much smaller than the average village is a hamlet. Not technically, no. A hamlet is usually a small village, a satellite village, but the real difference between a proper, normal village and a hamlet is what is produced. Unlike most villages which would have primarily large fields of grain which would be produced in order to make bread and other such things, a hamlet would primarily have vineyards. They would primarily produce wine. That's the real difference between a hamlet and other small satellite villages. When you're talking about towns, typically they would have between 1,000 and 8,000 people living in them. Around 2,000 to 2,500 would be the average town, and cities would be more than 8,000 people. And yeah, when you stop and think about it, in a modern environment, saying that a population center with 10,000 people is a city, it really doesn't work. So yes, medieval cities were quite small, not just in the amount of people living there, but in the surface area as well, because, well, medieval houses were typically smaller. Your average commoner would probably have a house with a single room, and everything important would be in that one room. A bed, possibly, in fact, most likely, a single bed for the entire family, a hearth for cooking and warmth, a table for eating and other such tasks, and a few other knickknacks. But, those are the most important things to a medieval home. That's because in the medieval era, people spent the majority of their time outside. Houses were pretty much only reserved for sleeping in them at night, cooking, and spending some more time during winter. And that means that the bare minimum for a house in the medieval era was much smaller than the modern bare minimum for a house, for a home. And this small size of the houses, and of course the simple fact that most towns and cities would of course have to be extra compact because they would all have to fit inside the defensible walls, it meant that they were actually smaller than you would visually. They were very small. They were small when it comes to population, and they were even smaller when it comes to surface area. Another thing I'd like to mention is how spread out they were. Well, first of all, villages made up the vast majority of all population centers. About 97-98% of all people will be living in villages. And a lot of fantasy has villages being very spread out. You could go for miles upon miles of forests and not even encounter anything. But was it like that in the real medieval era? Well, not really. Typically, villages would be around 10 to 12 miles away from each other, because that's basically half a day's walking distance, and as most peasants didn't have horses, if you wanted to take your bag of grain and sell it in the other village, you'd have to walk there. So yeah, those are just a few minor details that I wanted to get across about medieval population centers.